Let me tell you how you are very wrong into thinking that Africans or African tribes are in these Bantu, Cushites, Nilotes, Semites, or whatever other groupings, that these African tribes are in those groupings. You are very wrong to think that, and many of us believe that. But when you start analyzing everything, then you realize there is a huge misunderstanding about the grouping of African tribes. We've all of us always make these statements like, "Oh, those are Cushites, or those are Bantus, or those are Nilotes," and we think we are talking about the people. But no, those groupings are not about the people. And let me explain. Now, when the Europeans came to Africa, one of the things they wanted to understand about Africans is how different tribes were related. And they tried to figure out what method they were going to use to find that out. And the only method that was available then was to use linguistic study on the languages. And now they studied the linguistic relationship between the different languages that were being used in Africa. And out of that, they came up with these groups. So these are Bantu languages, these are Nilotic languages, these are Cushitic languages, and also the rest of the groupings, especially in West Africa and the southern part of Africa. Okay, of course, the southern part of Africa is more or less very closely related to the eastern and central Africa. Okay, now that's what the method they used, and for maybe 200-300 years, that's whatever they discovered then is what we've continued to use to group ourselves as Africans. Now today you say, oh, in Kenya there are three groups of people: the Bantu and the Nilotes and the Cushites, and we say that without thinking carefully of what that means. But what that actually means is not the people. That's where we need to start from. When they were doing that classification or categorization of Africans, it wasn't based on the people, it was based on the language. Now, here is the problem. You need to realize that language and people, the genetics, when I say people here, I mean the genetics, are not like, they don't go hand in hand usually. Up to some extent, but not completely or entirely. I'm going to explain how. You need to figure out that the spread of language and the spread of genetics are not the same thing. Language can move without people moving, and people can move and abandon language and adopt another language. And we can look at the most recent happenings. For example, relatively recently, you can see English has moved from Europe to Africa and to various parts of the world, and there are very many people speak English today. But if you go, you find a population speaking English, it doesn't mean that the genetic genes of the British are in them. No, it does not. It's just the language that moved. If you go a little bit back in history, the Arabic language spread to a lot of parts in the world as Islam was spreading. Now, the spread of Arabic language does not translate to the spread of the Arab gene. It does not. The language itself could move. We can speak of from the Spaniards going into the Southern America and colonizing that part of the world and influencing its culture and language to a very large extent. Of course, they left some genes there, but very small compared to the impact of language and culture. Now, what I'm trying to say is we need to separate the spread of language and the spread of culture. When we have that very clear in our minds, then we come to realize that whatever groupings we have of people in Africa don't necessarily translate to genetic relationships. They don't. Not necessarily is the word you need to underline. So when we say those are Cushitic people, we are talking of the language. We are not talking about the genes. We are talking of the language. When we say it's Nilotic people, it's not actually the genes, the people. We are talking of the language. So it could easily happen that there is a tribe of people who speak a Nilotic language and another tribe that speaks a Cushitic language. But those two tribes are genetically almost the same or very closely related. And then the the Nilotic speaking group is distantly or not even at all related to another group that speaks a Nilotic language, if that makes sense. So we have to have those understandings. So we've come to use these groupings very carelessly: Cushites, Nilotes, Bantus. We use them very carelessly because, and we've come to embrace them as if they mean the genetic makeup of the people. No, it does not. Now, and now when we understand that, then we can have very simple answers to some of the questions that we often run into when we are discussing history or when we look at people. For example, people say, oh, the Tutsis of Rwanda are Cushitic. But what does that mean actually? Because they have to speak a Cushitic language for them to be Cushitic. If they don't speak a Cushitic language, then what does it mean when you say they are Cushites? What does it really mean? It doesn't mean anything really. What is actually of great importance is to understand their genetic. And as of now, when you, whatever little genetic studies that have been done, for example, in the Rwanda, Congo, the so-called Tutsis are more closely related to the Hutus than any other group, and they are also more related to the Bantu groupings, the so-called Bantu groupings. Those are the tribes around the area they live than any other group. So what we need to maybe understand is that they are just genetically related to the people around them. They So when we say they have, maybe they are Cushites, or maybe they moved to the place they are because of how they look, and maybe they are keeping animals, but that does not make them Cushites. What needs to make them Cushites is the language. As what makes Somalis Cushites is not their genetic, is their language. What makes the Oromo Cushites is their language. What makes the Luos Nilotes is their language. What makes Kikuyus Bantu is their language. It's a possibility that a part of Kikuyu could be genetically related to groups that are among the Somali. That's very, very likely, especially when you compare how sometimes we think of the mixing of tribes as something that has happened recently. Tribes have always mixed. Tribes have always mixed. Some tribes have been swallowed by others. New tribes have formed from others. That has always happened in history. So when you get that, then you come to understand that we could have Kikuyus who are related to some Somali families genetically closer than we have that Somali family being related to another Somali family or clan. So make it simple. These groupings are on linguistic terms, not genetic. And genetic and language don't necessarily move together. Language can move. One tribe is conquered by another, they have to adopt a new language, and then that conqueror leaves, they maintain the new language, they forget the old language. They've not changed genetically, but they've changed their linguistic. Those are my random thoughts.